We can hire 4 junior developers for what we're paying you, he said with a slight smirk during my termination meeting. Nothing personal, just business optimization. My name is Robert Hayes, 58 years old. Senior infrastructure architect at Phoenix Real Estate Solutions for 16 years. I had built their entire technology foundation from the ground up, designed every expansion, maintained everything so seamlessly that the executives forgot how much the company relied on me until they decided they couldn't justify my salary anymore. I sat across from Marcus Williams, the new chief information officer who had been with the company for all of 8 months. He was 39, wore expensive frames, and had an MBA from Wharton. He had been brought in to streamline operations, which apparently meant eliminating the most experienced staff first. The severance package is competitive, said Sarah from Human Resources, sliding a folder across the table. 10 weeks salary plus your accumulated vacation time. I nodded, took the folder and said, understood. Anything else? Marcus looked almost disappointed. Maybe he had expected me to argue or threaten legal action. Give him something to report to the board about how difficult I was being. Don't you have questions? Most people in your situation want to discuss options, concerns, he said. I shrugged. Seems straightforward to me. Marcus exchanged glances with Sarah, who looked equally puzzled by my calm reaction. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't calm. I was just finished. There's a difference. Well, we'd appreciate your assistance with the transition, Marcus continued. The new development team will need some guidance on the system architecture. Perhaps a consulting arrangement for a few weeks. I'll consider it, I said, knowing I wouldn't. We shook hands. I cleared out my desk without complaint. 16 years of work fit into a single cardboard box. I nodded goodbye to a few colleagues who looked away awkwardly, afraid the same fate awaited them. As I walked to my car in the parking garage, my phone buzzed, a text from David, the database specialist I had hired 10 years ago. This is insane. The whole team is panicking. I didn't respond. At home, I sat on my patio overlooking the Colorado foothills, nursing a glass of whiskey, watching the sunset paint the mountains orange. My wife Linda placed a hand on my shoulder. What will you do now? I shrugged. Something will come along. What Marcus didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn, was that I hadn't just built their systems. I had custom-coded significant portions myself with minimal documentation because the company had always refused to fund a proper documentation team. Only I understood the intricate dependencies, the hidden security protocols, the complex network architecture, and I wasn't planning to explain it to anyone. I started at Phoenix Real Estate Solutions back when it was called Mountain View Holdings, a small property management firm with 6 apartment buildings and a handful of employees. Their entire infrastructure consisted of 3 desktop computers, a fax machine, and a DC internet connection. The owner, Frank Mountain, hired me away from a consulting job in Denver. We're growing, he told me. Need someone who can build us something that will last. Over 16 years, I had transformed that basic setup into an integrated property management platform that handled everything from tenant screening and lease processing to automated work orders and rent collection across 89 properties in 5 states. I had built it piece by piece, adapting, upgrading, refining as the company expanded. When Frank retired 4 years ago, his daughter Michelle sold the company to a private equity group that rebranded it as Phoenix Real Estate Solutions. They kept me on, impressed by what I had created. But things began to shift. New executives, new priorities, quarterly metrics became more important than long-term stability. The warning signs came gradually. First, they rejected my proposal for a documentation team. Too expensive, they said. We'll address it next quarter. That quarter never arrived. Then they started bringing in consultants, young beta types who talked about revolutionizing property management and leveraging cloud solutions. They would sit through my explanations of our system architecture with glazed expressions, then recommend off-the-shelf solutions that wouldn't integrate with our custom infrastructure. I kept pushing back, explaining why their approach wouldn't work, showing them the custom code that made our system unique. Eventually, they stopped inviting me to planning meetings. Linda noticed it before I did. They're pushing you out, she said one night over dinner. You need to prepare. I brushed her off. They need me. No one else understands how the whole system works together. That might be exactly the problem, she replied. 8 months ago, they hired Marcus as the new CIO. He came from a financial software company and immediately started talking about standardization and legacy system replacement. He hired 4 junior developers fresh out of college, had them shadowing me, asking questions about the system. I answered their questions, but I knew they weren't grasping the complexities. How could they? It had taken me years to build those systems, to understand the interdependence, to create the redundancies that kept everything running smoothly when problems arose. Last week, Marcus stopped by my office. Brief meeting tomorrow morning, he said casually. Just a quarterly check-in. I should have seen it coming. The first call came 2 weeks after my termination. I was in my home office updating my resume when my phone rang. Marcus Williams. I let it go to voicemail. Robert, it's Marcus. We're experiencing some issues with the tenant portal. The junior team is working on it, but they're having trouble understanding some of your code architecture. Could you give us a call back? It would just be a quick consultation. I deleted the message and went back to my resume. 4 more calls came that day, each voicemail sounding increasingly desperate. By evening, David texted me, "System's been down all day. Work orders aren't processing. Marcus is losing it." The next morning, Sarah from her call to Robert, "I hope you're well. I'm calling because we'd like to discuss a consulting arrangement, just temporary, to help with some current system issues. The compensation would be quite generous." I picked up my phone. "How generous? $400 per hour, minimum 6-hour engagement. I'll think about it and get back to you," I said, then hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the mountains. Linda placed a cup of coffee in front of me. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking they're discovering exactly what I'm worth." Over the next 4 days, the calls increased. Marcus, Sarah, even Michelle Mountain, who was still on the board. The tenant portal was down. The maintenance scheduling system was throwing errors. The automatic payment processing had failed, affecting thousands of residents. I didn't respond to any of them. On day 5, an email arrived from Summit Property Group, a regional competitor to Phoenix. They managed fewer properties, but had been expanding rapidly. The email was from their director of technology, Patricia Summit herself. "Robert, I heard about your situation at Phoenix. We've always respected your work from a distance. Would you be interested in discussing opportunities with us? We're looking to upgrade our entire property management infrastructure." I replied and set up a meeting for the following day. That evening, as Linda and I were preparing dinner, my doorbell rang. Marcus Williams stood on my porch, his expensive glasses slightly askew, his normally perfect suit wrinkled. "Robert, I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but we have a crisis situation. The entire system is down. Nothing is working. The team can't figure out what's wrong or how to fix it." I leaned against the doorframe. "That sounds serious." "It is. We need your help. The board has authorized me to offer you a substantial consulting fee. $750 per hour. Whatever it takes." I thought about the cardboard box in my garage. 16 years of work reduced to a few mementos. I thought about nothing personal, just business optimization. I thought about the documentation team they'd never approved. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles," I said quietly, "but I have an interview tomorrow. Something will come along." Just like I thought, I closed the door on his stunned face and went back to making dinner. For the first time since my termination, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just understanding. I wasn't going to help them fix what they had broken. The interview with Patricia Summit went better than expected. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Boulder, away from both companies' offices. "I've followed your work for years," Patricia said, stirring her coffee. "That integrated property management system you built at Phoenix is legendary in our industry. Nobody else has anything close to it." "Thank you," I said. "It took time." "That's what I want to talk about, time. We're looking to build something similar, but we don't want to start from scratch. We need someone who understands the architecture, the integration points, the security layers, someone who can build us something better than what's out there." "I'm interested," Patricia smiled. "Good, because I'm prepared to offer you the position of Chief Systems Architect. Full benefits, equity participation, and a salary 25 higher than what you were making at Phoenix." It was a good offer. "Too good? Almost. Why me?" I asked. "There are younger engineers out there. Cheaper ones." Patricia laughed. "You sound like your former employer. We tried that route, hired 4 bright young developers from top schools. They built us something sleek and modern that crashes every time we get more than 150 simultaneous users. We don't need cheap. We need reliable." I accepted the offer the next day. Meanwhile, Phoenix's problems were escalating. David kept me updated through occasional texts. The system had been partially restored, but critical functions were still failing. They had brought in an expensive consulting firm that specialized in legacy system recovery. A week after I started at Summit, Marcus called again. "Robert, please, this is getting serious. We've lost access to payment records for the past 4 months. Tenants are complaining about incorrect charges. The consulting team says they need your input on the database structure." I was tempted to ignore it, but something made me pick up. "Marcus, I'm employed elsewhere now at exclusive contract. I'm afraid I can't help you. We'll triple whatever they're paying you for just 3 days of your time." It's not about the money, then what is it about? Revenge. Are you enjoying watching us struggle? I paused, considering my answer carefully. No, Marcus, I'm not enjoying it. But you made a business decision. You decided my experience wasn't worth the cost. Now you're discovering what that actually means. The board wants to discuss bringing you back. Full salary plus a signing bonus. For a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it quickly faded. Going back would solve nothing. The same executives who decided I was expendable would be waiting for the next opportunity to cut costs. I appreciate the offer, but I've made a commitment to Summit Property Group. Marcus' voice hardened. You know, there could be legal implications if we discover you intentionally made our systems difficult to maintain. Non-compete clauses, intellectual property concerns, there it was. The threat I had been expecting. The system is exactly as it was when the company repeatedly denied my requests for a documentation team. I replied evenly. Every line of code belongs to Phoenix is specified in my employment contract. I've taken nothing with me except my experience. Feel free to have your lawyers contact mine. I hung up, hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. The accusation that I had somehow sabotaged them was the final insult. At Summit, I was starting fresh. Building systems properly from the ground up with full documentation, training programs for the engineering team, and redundancies that would prevent the kind of catastrophe Phoenix was experiencing. I wasn't going to look back anymore, but I wasn't going to help them either. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. A month after joining Summit Property Group, I received an unexpected visitor in my new office. David, my former database specialist, stood awkwardly in the doorway holding a laptop bag. Got time for lunch? He asked. Over sandwiches at a nearby deli, David filled me in on the chaos at Phoenix. It's worse than you think, he said, lowering his voice despite the noisy lunchtime crowd. They've lost access to historical data going back 4 years. The backup systems are corrupted somehow. The consulting firm is saying they might need to rebuild from scratch. I wasn't surprised. The backup system had multiple redundancies and security protocols that needed to be followed precisely. Skip one step, and the entire process would fail in a way designed to protect tenant data from unauthorized access. That's not all, David continued. I found something when I was trying to help the consultants understand the payment processing system. Marcus had been planning your termination for months. He had been meeting with the board, convincing them that your custom infrastructure was too expensive to maintain. How do you know this? David pulled out his laptop and showed me a series of emails he had discovered in the system archives. Emails between Marcus and the board discussing the legacy staff reduction plan, and specifically naming me as the primary target. He told them they could replace you with cheaper engineers and transition to off-the-shelf solutions within 8 months. David said he projected cost savings of over $1.2 million annually. I read through the emails, feeling a strange detachment. One line from Marcus stood out: his custom systems are unnecessarily complex. He's make himself indispensable by design. Not necessity. There's more, David said. The private equity firm that owns Phoenix is planning to sell. They've been prepping for this for over a year. Marcus was brought in specifically to cut costs and make the company look more profitable before the sale. Now it all made sense. The push for standardization, the resistance to proper documentation, the sudden focus on reducing senior staff costs. It wasn't about improving the company, it was about dressing it up for a quick flip. Why are you showing me this? I asked. David closed his laptop. Because I quit yesterday, and I'm not the only one. Half the IT department has left. The consultants are estimating at least 8 months to restore full functionality, maybe longer. He hesitated, and because Phoenix's biggest client, Rockwell Holdings, is considering jumping ship. They've lost faith in the management system. I thought about the implications. Rockwell represented nearly 35% of Phoenix's revenue. Losing them would be devastating, especially with a sale pending. What will you do now? I asked. David grinned. Actually, I was hoping Summit might be hiring database specialists. Later that afternoon, I spoke with Patricia about bringing David on board. She agreed immediately. We were building a team brick by brick, with people who understood what it meant to create systems that lasted. That evening, I received another call from Marcus. This time, his voice had lost its authoritative edge. Robert, please, the situation is critical. Rockwell is threatening to terminate their contract. The board is questioning my decisions. We need your help. I'm sorry, Marcus. I can't help you. Name your price, anything. It's not about price. It's about respect for experience, for the work that goes into building something right the first time. The line was silent for a moment. You knew this would happen, he said finally. You knew exactly what would break and when. No, Marcus, I just knew what I had built and what it took to maintain it. Information I tried to share many times. I ended the call feeling neither triumph nor regret. just the quiet certainty that some lessons can only be learned through failure. The opportunity came faster than I expected. 10 weeks into my role at Summit Property Group, Patricia called me into her office. "I just got off the phone with Catherine Rockwell," she said, referring to the CEO of Rockwell Holdings. "They are officially terminating their contract with Phoenix next month. They want to know if we can handle their portfolio." Rockwell Holdings managed over 12 units across the Mountain West. It would more than double Summit's current operations. "We're not ready for that kind of scale," I admitted. "The new system is coming along, but it's only 60% complete." Patricia leaned forward. "What would it take to get ready if we had to?" I thought about it. 4 more senior engineers, dedicated server infrastructure, and at least 10 weeks of development time. Even then, it would be tight. Catherine's desperate. Phoenix failures are affecting their reputation with tenants. She's willing to give us 14 weeks and fund the infrastructure expansion. This was the moment, the turning point. If Summit took on Rockwell and succeeded, it would establish us as a serious competitor in the industry. If we failed, it could sink both companies. "Let me think about the architecture," I said. "I'll have a plan by tomorrow." That night, I barely slept. I sketched system diagrams, mapped data migration pathways, considered scaling challenges. By morning, I had a plan, ambitious but achievable. A hybrid approach that would let us onboard Rockwell's properties in stages, minimizing disruption. When I presented it to Patricia, she studied it carefully. "This is solid," she said finally. "But I notice you've included a substantial documentation phase that adds 4 weeks to the timeline." "It's non-negotiable," I replied. "That's where Phoenix failed. We document everything from day one. We train the team on every component. No single points of failure." Patricia nodded. "I'll take your word for it. Let's move forward." The next weeks were intense. We hired 6 more engineers, including 3 who had recently left Phoenix. David built a database migration tool that could translate Phoenix's data structure into our new system. I designed a modular architecture that could scale with Rockwell's needs. Halfway through the project, I received an email from Michelle Mountain, the former owner's daughter, who still sat on Phoenix's board. "Robert, I want to apologize for how things ended. The board was misled about the implications of letting you go. Marcus has been removed as CEO. We're struggling to recover. And Rockwell's departure will hit us hard. If you're ever interested in coming back, the door is open." I didn't respond. 12 weeks into our 14-week timeline, we were ready for a staged rollout. Rockwell's smallest region, comprising 500 units in northern Colorado, would migrate first. If successful, the remaining regions would follow. The day before the migration, Patricia called me into her office again. A familiar face was waiting, Catherine Rockwell herself. "So you're the systems architect," Catherine said, standing to shake my hand. "Patricia has told me a lot about you." "All good, I hope." Catherine smiled. "She says you've built us something that won't break down every time we add a new property. Something that will grow with us." "That's the plan. I also hear you used to work for Phoenix." I nodded, unsure where she was going with this. "They're in trouble. You know, the private equity firm is trying to sell. But with Rockwell leaving and their system still not fully functional, they're not finding many interested buyers." She paused. "Except one." "Who's that?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Summit Property Group," Patricia said. "We're considering making an offer at a substantial discount to what they were valued at 8 months ago." I looked between them, processing the implications. "If that happens," Catherine continued, "we'd want someone who understands both companies to lead the integration, someone who could salvage what's valuable from Phoenix's infrastructure while transitioning everything to your new architecture." "Are you asking if I'd be willing to work on that?" I clarified. Patricia nodded. "Only if the acquisition goes through, and only if you're comfortable with it." I thought about the irony. The system I had built, the people I had trained, the company that had discarded me, all potentially coming back under my direction. "I'd be willing," I said finally. "But I have one condition. We do it right. Full documentation, proper training, no shortcuts." "Agreed," Patricia said. "We've learned that lesson." As I walked back to my office, I felt no vindication, no desire for revenge, just the simple satisfaction of knowing that good work done right eventually speaks for itself. 8 months later, I stood in the lobby of what had once been Phoenix Real Estate Solutions headquarters. The sign now read Summit Integrated Property Management. The acquisition had gone through for less than a third of what the company had been valued at before my departure. Patricia and I walked through the office, greeting former Phoenix employees who would be staying on through the transition. Some looked away awkwardly. Others smiled with relief. A few, those who had worked closely with me over the years, nodded with quiet understanding. Marcus was gone, along with most of the executive team that had approved my termination. Michelle Mountain had stayed on as a consultant, helping ease the transition with legacy clients. When we reached the server room, my old domain, I paused through the glass. I could see the hardware I had specified, the blinking lights of systems I had designed. Want to go in? Patricia asked. No need, I replied. We'll be migrating everything to the new infrastructure anyway. In the main conference room, the remaining Phoenix staff had gathered for the announcement. Patricia introduced me as the Chief Integration Officer, who would be overseeing the technical transition. Many of you already know Robert, she said. He built the original systems that ran this company for nearly 2 decades. Now he'll be guiding us through the integration of both companies' technologies into something better than either had before. As I looked out at the faces, some familiar, some new, I felt no triumph, no desire to say I told you so. What would be the point? Instead, I spoke briefly about the transition plan, the timeline, the support that would be available to everyone during the process. I emphasized that no one would be left behind due to cost-cutting measures. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. 1 year after the acquisition, Summit Integrated Property Management had become the largest property management company in the Mountain West. The migration was complete, with all properties now running on the new system I had designed, fully documented, properly staffed, and functioning smoothly. On a crisp autumn morning, I drove to the office for a final meeting with Patricia. The aspens along the foothills had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. A fitting backdrop for the conclusion of this chapter. The board approved your proposal, Patricia said as soon as I sat down. The technical education division will launch next quarter. You'll have full autonomy to design the curriculum and hire instructors. This had been my condition for staying after the integration was complete. Not a higher title or more money, but the creation of a division dedicated to training the next generation of systems engineers and architects, teaching them not just how to code, but how to build things meant to last. Thank you, I said. That means a lot. No thank you, Patricia replied. What you've built here, it's remarkable. Not just the technology, but the culture around it, the documentation, the knowledge sharing, the emphasis on quality over quick fixes. Later that afternoon, I cleared out my integration office. Unlike my hasty exit from Phoenix, this was a planned transition to my new role. As I packed my things, Michelle Mountain knocked on the door. Got a minute? She asked. We walked to the small courtyard outside the building. My father asked about you, she said. He's retired in Arizona now, but he still follows company news. He was glad to hear you were back. In a manner of speaking, how is Frank? I asked. Good, playing a lot of golf. Michelle paused. He always said letting you go would be the biggest mistake this company could make. Turns out he was right. I nodded, unsure what to say. I learned something from all this. Michelle continued. Value isn't always visible until it's gone. As I drove home along the mountain highway, I thought about value, the value of experience, of care taken, of doing things right the first time, about systems built to last and the people who build them. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't needed to. I had simply moved forward, building something better, something that would outlast any individual decision or short-term thinking. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued is simply to prove your worth elsewhere and let the results speak for themselves. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.